There's really only one relationship that we have, and that's the relationship that we have with ourselves. And that shows up in a lot of different ways. Avoidant attachment, where we avoid other people because we're afraid of rejection, or anxious attachment, where we cling to other people because we're afraid of abandonment, and myriad other examples we could go through. The point is, attachment matters, and it's based on the relationship that we have with ourselves, but it's really rooted in childhood. So, in order to understand the relationship that we have that's breaking down, the breakup or the heartache, the heartbreak, it really starts with understanding emotions, patterns, coping mechanisms, and all of that can be summed up by talking about relationship attachment. And in this program, we're really trying to develop our love for self that has no limits. But when we get into a relationship with somebody else and we have insecure attachment of some kind, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, it's like we're sitting in front of a checkered board that's red and black checkers, and there's somebody sitting across from us. Maybe that's our ex or current partner. Maybe it's a boss or a coworker or a best friend or a sibling. And we have our data, they have their data, and it's like we have the rules for chess and they have the rules for checkers, and we don't understand why they keep on breaking the rules. We don't understand why there keeps on being conflict showing up. So it's important to understand that this attachment comes from early childhood. And when we're little kids, we're like sponges, right? That's why they say that little kids are like sponges. We're just soaking up everything. And this is early childhood conditioning or subconscious programming. And that's because when we're kids, we have a ton of neuroplasticity, which is just the brain's ability to change. Our minds are very open. It's like a blank slate. And we're actually in brain waves that are very suggestible. We're taking in everything as fact. And this is neurologically and evolutionarily advantageous because it teaches us how to talk and walk and have fine motor skills and gross motor skills. So really by the age of 7 or 8 years old, our subconscious is pretty solidified. And so that relationship that we had with our primary caregivers solidifies the relationship that we have with ourselves. And later on in life, if that is an insecure relationship that we have with ourselves, then we end up having insecure attachment to our significant others, as well as other significant people in our lives. And it's because when we were kids, we were in a meditative state. And that's great because it allowed us to create an internal system about how the world works so that we can have predictable outcomes. And our subconscious is programmed with repetition and emotion. So if we have a strong emotional event like trauma or some sort of thing that is confusing to us that feels like trauma to a child, or if we're told something repetitively that invokes a lot of emotion, we get programmed subconsciously. And this is very positive so that we can understand how to carefully unlock a lock and how to move our tongue in order to formulate words. But there are negative consequences too. And because we have these disempowering beliefs, core wounds, we'll revert to survival instincts when one of these core wounds, these disempowering beliefs, are triggered as a result of something difficult, some sort of a traumatic event in our lives, like heartbreak, causes anxiety, stress, depression, maybe panic attacks, maybe feelings of listlessness. Instead of fight or flight, we're in that freeze zone because we've gone over the hump of fight or flight and into just inertia. So, for example, if when we were children, we were yelled at a lot, we internalize, I'm bad. There's something wrong with me. And then we may withdraw, causing more avoidant attachment, or we may overcompensate and turn to people pleasing. But the reality is we take responsibility for getting reprimanded, for getting yelled at, and think to ourselves, there's something wrong with me. There's something fundamentally wrong with me. And we end up with these disempowering beliefs. And on the surface, it causes triggers. So, there are these 3 different types of attachment styles that I'm sure you've heard about. And I really think that we shouldn't call them an attachment style. It's a state, because we can be in a state of excitement. We can be in a meditative state. And these things change very easily. Instead of being something that it's labeled, you are avoidant, you are anxious, or you are that combination of anxious and avoidant. So as we go through these different attachment states, I invite you to analyze your parents, your exes, your other primary caregivers, your current relationship situation, whether that's kind of fizzling out or maybe there's been some significant heartbreak involved, and yourself, of course. People who are avoidant tend to have traits of being very independent. They might be seen as highly logical and less emotive. And they really prioritize a lot of autonomy. In early childhood, this was caused by their parents not really being attuned to their needs. So it's not necessarily neglect necessarily. It's just, it could be neglect, but more of an emotional neglect, just a general lack of emotional attunement, bordering on emotional abandonment. And so the effects are that the child learns that it's best to suppress their emotions and hide their emotions. They learn that by example. And then they also may have been reprimanded for having strong emotions. And they see that positive emotions get rewarded and negative emotions are, punished or neglected. So they have to learn to self-soothe, to rely on themselves. So they suppress their emotions subconsciously, and then they repress their emotions consciously. So later in life, they end up saying things like, I'm fine. Everything's fine. You've seen that meme or the t-shirt or the mug. Everything's fine. There's something blowing up in the background, One that my dad, who's very avoidant, would always say is don't hurt my feeling. One, like he only had one feeling. And typically people who are more avoidant experience like a low level irritation for anyone's vulnerability. So as a result, in relationships, they tend to move very slowly. They're very cautious. They also tend to feel that there should not be any problems in the relationship. And if there are, they pull away and they start to think that the grass is greener somewhere else. They tend to need a lot of space in relationships, especially if there's a problem, especially when arguments arise. And when they are triggered in some way, empathy goes down. And so they might be seen as very cold, insensitive, or like rude or mean, but it's really coming from a place of fear, a place of protection. And the long and the short of it is they just don't have the skill set. They weren't taught, they weren't modeled how to know what their emotions are, and they weren't taught that their emotions are okay. And so they aren't very sensitive to the emotions of others. So they tend to have a lot of difficulty being vulnerable, and they're also sometimes unable to soothe their partners when their partners are triggered. So they may end up having feelings of like being trapped, powerlessness. That's the core wound and the disempowering thinking that sometimes comes up. So after a big breakup, they might think, I am never going to date again, and completely reject any kind of intimacy. They also tend to think that they don't really have any needs And so when we jump into needs work, like we did in the last section, they might be at a loss thinking like, I don't have any needs. They might also think that they don't have any triggers, that they don't have any core wounds, that they don't have any disempowering thinking. Sometimes these people who are avoidant will actually test, if they fill out like an online quiz, they'll test secure because they're ultra independent. And some of the core wounds that show up are unworthiness, feeling unlovable, and also unimportant. And so they stuff their emotions, and the behavioral coping mechanism that they tend to is that flight, right? We say that there's 4 F's of stress: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, but they just tend to want to be alone. They may also lean into working a lot because that is something that they can control. It's something very logical. There's not a lot of emotion involved typically. And avoidant people are classically accused of being narcissistic, even though they may not have all 9 traits of a narcissist, according to the DSM. And they tend to be attracted to anxiously attached people. And that reason for the narcissism, that feeding and then retracting, is really just a natural tendency of avoidant people to really want that closeness in relationship, but get scared and pull away. I know that's a lot. So just take a moment, breathe in and out of the nose. You might want to breathe into the nose and out the mouth with a relax through your body. It's okay if that brought up a lot of emotion. Let's talk about people who tend to anxious. So the personality traits of people who are more anxiously attached are that they are very trusting. They move very quickly in relationships. They're often said to be thoughtful and kind. They're very attentive in close relationships, very warm, very likable. And really, they move quickly in relationships of all kinds, even friendships. And they're very flexible, not necessarily physically flexible, but they're people pleasers, right? They're very flexible. They don't have needs. Really, they do. They're just denying them in order to get that one big need met of closeness and connection, and avoiding being abandoned. So what causes this? In early childhood, they tend to receive a lot of warmth and love from caregivers, but that warmth and love tends to be kind of inconsistent. So they might have a really hardworking, avoidant parent who isn't around much. Maybe they have very warm parents, but then their parents work a lot and they have to be put in a daycare. So they have these positive associations with affection and care, but they also have this feeling of it being withdrawn and not understanding why. And so they're not enjoying being dismissed or abandoned. Sometimes there may have been like an emergency situation. They may have, been in a NICU or in an incubator for several months, or, we've had some clients who were actually adopted at a young age when they don't remember. And this can cause anxious attachment as well, just because of the change that being taken away from the birth parents. And maybe the birth parents weren't very attentive, but then the receptive parents are super attentive. So the effects, basically, people who have anxious attachment didn't have enough independence from their caregivers consistently enough, and enough modeling to learn to meet their own needs. So there's a big difference between anxious and avoidant that you can see coming out here. I mean, we all know that if we're abandoned by our caregivers, we're going to die. That's just a fact. And so we all have this need for comfort and closeness. It's just that people who tend more anxious feel that this comfort and closeness is necessary for survival, even into adulthood. So people who are more anxious focus on trying to get those needs met, trying to get back into that safety, that comfort, that warmth. So as a result, later on in relationships, they tend to have really unrealistic expectations for what their relationships are supposed to look like. They tend to not have any boundaries at all. They can tend toward loneliness. And they also believe that their intimate relationship, that should be the number one priority. They also can put people on a pedestal when they first get into a relationship, and they worry a lot about the relationship ending, about being abandoned. And later on, they might feel a sense of frustration and like they're being taken advantage of because they've been giving, and feeling like it's not being reciprocated. They also tend to take things very personally. So they apply meaning to really small incidents, small actions, and then worry that they're going to be abandoned. So for behavioral coping mechanisms, they tend toward the fight out of the 4 F's of stress and the fawning. So whereas anxious people flee, whereas avoidant people, I misspoke there, whereas avoidant people will flee, anxious people fight. So even though it might not be actual closeness, they'll engage in difficult conversations, they'll nitpick, they'll start fights because they're still getting that attention, even though it's negative attention. And the fawning is people pleasing. They'll also tend toward clinging. So again, I know that's a lot. There might have been a lot of things that came up. So just take a minute, breathe in and out of the nose, tap into the body, ground yourself. You might, maybe if you're listening to this, be like, I'm both. Or be able to recognize, and I'm not really sure if my ex was anxious or avoidant. Well, they might be a combination of anxious and avoidant attachment. So the personality traits of people who are both anxious and avoidant, they tend to be very present. You can call that hypervigilant. They're very charming and likable. They're very generous in close relationships, and they tend to not have boundaries until they put up a hard boundary. So the relationships can be very intense, and they can also be labeled as being hot and cold. They are very suspicious. They tend to be cheaters. And they're incredibly resilient, and they'll bounce back and get into another relationship. So what causes this? In early childhood, one word: chaos. Chaos. They saw caregivers fighting a lot. They saw caregivers being passive aggressive. Perhaps there was violence in the home, whether that was verbal or physical. They may have had sexual abuse trauma. They may have had an addictive parent, an alcoholic parent who was literally hot and cold. They may have had a caregiver who had a personality disorder of some kind, diagnosed or not. It's basically enmeshment, trauma, codependency. I know it's a lot of buzzwords I'm throwing around. So we can have people who are anxious, avoidant, and lean avoidant. We can have people who are anxious and avoidant and lean anxious. And we can have people who flip-flop according to the other partner in the relationship. The effects of this, as I said, are difficulty trusting, hypervigilance, wanting to get close and then getting scared. And their primary core wound is, I am unsafe. So they don't want to be controlled, but they also need that closeness. So they have difficulty setting boundaries at first, and then they set really strong boundaries during a conflict because they've been people pleasing. And now they're like, no, this is not going to happen anymore. So they also tend to want evidence from their lover. Why do you love me? Why is they really want to hear that, get a lot of validation. And like I said, unfortunately, it can lead to lying and cheating. So behavioral coping mechanisms, these individuals experience all 4 F's of stress: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And that freeze comes when we've had so much trauma, so much anxiety, so much fighting, so much fleeing that we really just don't know what to do. And that's not necessarily within the relationship or in the moment, but historically in our lives, that we just tend toward that freezing because we don't know what the right move is to make. People who are anxious and avoidant might test their partners, ask questions several different times in several different ways to see if the answer is consistent. And it's a really unhealthy way to go about. Obviously, direct communication is much better. They also tend to stonewalling and spitefulness, just like avoidant people. They also tend to criticism, just like anxious people. So in a word, it's emotional volatility. So they might withdraw and then be super needy, maybe actually immediately, and they tend toward needing the creature comforts. Binging on TV or food or, alcohol, a lot of gaming. It's not always the case, but it can be common. So take a minute. I know that's a lot. Maybe it brought up a lot of scenes from childhood or from your past relationships. So breathe intentionally in and out of the nose, ground yourself. The good news is there are solutions. There are solutions to all these attachment states. We have meditative states because when we were ages 0 to 7, we were in deep theta as well as alpha, but a lot of theta brainwaves, and we are highly programmable. That's deep hypnosis. And so we were programmed with these attachment states. So when you take time to learn about yourself, when you learn to care for yourself, when you learn about attachment styles, when you learn to move securely in relationships, then you can sit across that checkerboard. And even though you have the rules for chess and they have the rules for checkers, you can establish a shared language so that you can end up with relationship success, despite the rules that you were given when you were a child, so that you can move into secure attachment. And what does secure attachment look like? Emotional regulation. People who are securely attached tend to be able to actually focus better. And that's because they're less emotional. Their mental real estate is not being taken up by triggers. They tend to be more stable, and they tend to be able to understand multiple perspectives. When faced with conflict, people who are securely attached value working through the conflict. They don't like to leave things unresolved. They don't like to keep fighting. And they don't tend to take things as personally. They're just less likely to be triggered, maybe because they've worked through their attachment style, their wounding, their core wounding, their disempowering beliefs, or they've just gotten really good at meeting their needs and setting boundaries. And they can share their feelings. They can validate one another. They can understand that maybe they don't understand that person's perspective, but they can understand that there is a different perspective. They tend to be very fair and respectful during conflict. And they feel that their partner should want to resolve things too. Generally, they think that conflict is normal, but it shouldn't be excessive. They understand that both parties should be able to be heard, understood, and seen in the relationship. They want healthy interdependence. So not independence, not enmeshment or codependence, but healthy interdependence. They want to be able to rely on one another, but also work through challenges separately and together, and know that the difficult moments are going to happen, but that they're on the same side of the table working on a puzzle instead of battling one another across the table. So this is our goal, of course. In this course, we are trying to work towards secure attachment. How do we do it? We're doing it. That's the good news. We're learning how to meditate. We're understanding ourselves. We're learning about our attachment style or attachment state. We're learning what disempowering core wounds we have on the inside. We're learning what our needs are. We're learning to meet our own needs. We're learning to communicate our needs. Once we put all these things together, we're working toward being able to use something that we call the communication formula, but you need all these pieces, parts in order to put it together. so that we can have this love for ourselves without any limits, so that we can love others without any limits. And it begins with a whole heap of curiosity. Curiosity enhances consciousness because judgment means I know what this is. I'm labeling this. I understand this. Curiosity comes with questions. I wonder, what might that mean? I wonder how we can solve this. And so when we bring curiosity instead of judgment, it enhances our consciousness. And curiosity and consciousness together enhance our ability to reprogram our core wounds. Curiosity about our needs brings that subconscious need up to the consciousness. Curiosity about our core wounds enhances our ability to be curious about what may have caused it. Because remember, it's not the itty bitty shitty committee. It's the itty bitty kitty committee, KID. It's the kid who took in things as absolute fact and understood there's something wrong with me, or I'm going to be rejected, or I'm going to be abandoned. And they end up with disempowering core wounds, an anxious attachment or avoidant attachment, or some combination thereof. So this is the beginning. Awareness is always the key, and curiosity is going to lead you to that awareness. I know that this has been a really long session. I invite you to replay this video as many times as you need to really understand yourself, understand your past relationships, and join the community. Reach out. Let us know how we can support you.